Welcome to another edition of the Brazilian Shirt Name podcast. We've all made it. The whole gang's in the house. The legendary Tim Vickery. Well, when I say you're in the house, you're in Brazil, which is a warmer house than we're in.
Yeah, not at the moment. No, it's raining, and it's a flat, really, more than a house. But I take your point.
Well, it's raining over here as well. Not just raining, but freezing rain. And also, it's a hotel room, not a house for me either. But we've got Nick Davidson with us. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Dotun. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks very much. Is that a house you're in?
I am in a basement, actually, but I can confirm it is raining pretty heavily here as well. So
it is. And where are you at the moment?
So I'm just outside Milton Keynes in a town called Buckingham.
Yes.
Which is famous for absolutely nothing, I think. Apart from the Palace, which is like probably about 60, 70 miles away.
And also, it's Lindsay's surname, I suppose. Does that make it famous?
Quite possibly, yeah. It's about all we've got.
Yes, stretch that one in. Most people do. I was going to say most people don't remember Lindsay Buckingham. Yeah, they remember all the ladies in the house, but not necessarily him. Anyway,
see, I'm an equal opportunities Fleetwood Mac rememberer, which I think is part of the story that we are trying to tell today. When we take the road less traveled by and maybe not enough traveled by. Nick, come on down, explain your presence, explain who you are, and explain what you want to do over the next few minutes.
Okay, so what I'd like to talk about today is a game in particular that happened just last year in the German FA Cup, the Women's German FA Cup, the DFB Pokal. And it was a game between the two Hamburg clubs, FC Sankt Pauli and Hamburger SV or HSV of Kevin Keegan fame. And it was their first meeting in the German Cup competition. And it was pretty unique because it was the first time the game had been played inside Sankt Pauli Stadium, the Millerntor-Stadion.
Wow, that sounds like a cracker.
Yeah, there's plenty to unpack here. And first, I mean, apart from a brief stopover at Frankfurt Airport, ludicrously referred to as Frankie Furci by my Brazilian co-passengers, I have no experience of Germany whatsoever. So first, can you paint some kind of big picture of women's football in Germany? I imagine that it started from a very low base, because one thinks of the Nazi regime and how that was emphatic in the woman's place is in the home, being a breeder of the next race of Aryan masters. So how does the history of women's football in Germany fit into that?
I mean, I think there are a lot of parallels between the history of women's football in Germany as to in England, in Britain. You're right. So the German history of football generally, the evolution of football in Germany is actually very different to that in the UK. So a lot of the clubs that we now know and talk about in Germany as men's teams came from not necessarily a solely football background. So they would come from like this gymnastic movement of the kind of early 20th century. And from there, they would evolve into football departments. Sankt Pauli, the club that I support and that we're going to talk about mostly, they followed that particular route as well. So the actual birth of football is very different. And but for the women's history, in the modern day, we've really got to talk about the bans. So we know in the UK that from 1921 to 1971, for 50 years, and under the auspices of the FA, games still went on, but football for women under the FA remit was not allowed. And we kind of know a little bit about that history now, that of the kind of success of women's clubs in the First World War, whilst the men were away fighting, they got these massive attendances. And the FA, when the First World War stopped, was suddenly like, hang on a minute, this is a threat to our revenue streams, or not just the FA, the clubs, and banned it. the same thing happened in Germany. So from a little bit later on, and I'm not particularly up on what happened before this period, but from 1955, June 1955 to October 1970, there was a complete ban on women's football in Germany being affiliated to the DFB, the German FA. So their history mirrors the kind of their British counterparts in that sense. After 1970, you get that kind of slow growth of women's teams, not particularly attached to their male counterparts. So it tended to grow a lot more separately and not necessarily be a part of like the parent male club. So that growth happened very slowly, and was hampered all the way along by men obstructing it, all the way through to the present day. So that's kind of the background of, the loose background of women's football. Interestingly as well, during the 1970s, I found this fascinating. There were, in German football, there were numerous rule variations. So, for example, matches were 70 minutes long and not 90 minutes long. Games weren't played between November and March because the conditions were deemed too difficult for women to play in. Women weren't allowed to wear studs. They used size 4 footballs, and then they had a ruling where they were allowed to use their hands to protect themselves if it was going to hit a vulnerable part of their body. So it wasn't even necessary at that point that the same game. I mean, it was it was still goals and a net and that kind of thing, but the rules were significantly different to make it different to the men's game. And it's only in more recent times that those rules have faded away and the game has become the same as we know for the men.
It seems almost laughable now, if you're a young person listening to this, that first of all, the football teams, football associations were able to get away with banning women from playing football officially, because of course today it would be illegal. But it seems laughable, but then you think, you will know this rather than Tim, who's out in Brazil. Just over the last week, we've had the continuing scandal of the Garrick Club here in Britain, in London, which is a men's only club, with people saying that, and they refusing to budge from that stance. They don't allow women into the club at all, but somehow they're able to do that when it's a private club, at least. And the Garrick is really one of the top sort of gentlemen's clubs. If I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure the King was a member at some point. If I'm wrong about that, I'm wrong. And I saw the broadcaster John Soper have the audacity to say that, he's just joined the Garrick Club, but he's only doing it to sort of bring about change, but he goes and joins it. I don't know how it's regarded now in Germany when they look back at that time. I know here in Britain, a lot of women are very angry. They're very angry that they were stopped from playing football for half a century. Is that how people view it in Germany, women?
I would assume so. I mean, very much. I mean, I'm based in the UK, so I'm a frequent visitor to Germany and to Hamburg. But I would say those experiences are exactly the same. And you're right. There's a real feeling that there's a lost generation of women in Britain that were denied that opportunity to play football, and the emotion around that is quite rightly quite strong. And I would assume that it is very similar. I mean, in Germany, one thing I did miss out a little bit is that although they were banned under the auspices of the DFB, the German FA, until 1970, women's football did exist. They actually set up a German Women's Football Association, and matches were played. There were like kind of international games in inverted commas. So women did play the sport. They just weren't allowed to do it on German FA sanctioned pitches or with referees or coaches that had a connection to that club. So it did exist, and I think like in Britain, the only reason it was kind of taken back under the main FA control is that opportunity to exert power over it, and maybe in the longer term to be able to monetize it, to get something back from it. So I think until it got to that point, they weren't interested, and then that kind of that slow shift that saw you know, the FA thought, hang on a minute, we can't just ignore this. It's still going on. We need to get it under our control, and, you know, make sure that we're the people in power here. So there's a definite power dynamic connected to all this.
Take us to the city of Hamburg. Paint us a picture of Hamburg and how the two clubs fit into this city. Yeah,
and I think this is really interesting and really important, and it goes beyond just the women's football side of it. So I'm kind of fully expecting Dotun has been to Hamburg, and I don't know why. Maybe it's relatively proximity to Sweden. I imagine he's got a story.
You're absolutely
Have you
right.
got a story, Dotun?
I have got a story, and it's an interesting football story because it was Hamburg, the Hamburg football team rather than Sankt Pauli, where I happened to be on a train on a Saturday, which was packed with Hamburg supporters. And these particular supporters were racist supporters who were giving me a hard time. Then some other Hamburg supporters said, look, come and sit with us. You know, we'll protect you. Gave me lots of beer. So by midday, I was drunk. I was off my face. And the other lot were going Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. And I was laughing my head off. That's my story of Hamburg. But I have gone to see, as a result of that, I subsequently, because you're absolutely right. In the old days, I would take a train between London and Sweden. It used to cost about 24 quid because, you know, in the days when you're under 26. So it was a 24-hour, more or less, journey. A long stretch of it would be through Germany. So I've been to the Reeperbahn several times. I've been, like I say, to a football match one time. And I kind of knew Hamburg, but this is going back 30, 40 years. And I imagine it's changed dramatically since then.
Possibly. I think what you've done there is kind of, in that train experience, almost encapsulated the German football experience in a nutshell. So in Hamburg itself, there's two clubs. Well, there's actually only one club, and that's Sankt Pauli, because Hamburg, Hauslau, HSV, they actually exist in the suburbs. So they're a team of the suburbs. So a Sankt Pauli fan would argue there's only one team in Hamburg. But
well, I'm in Salford at the moment. There's only one team. Well, actually, there's two teams in Salford. One of them happened to be Manchester United, but they're definitely not in Manchester. Yeah. As you can ask any City fan, they're not in Manchester.
So these problems are the same the world over. But your experience there, I think, is quite pertinent to the German kind of football experience of certainly of the 80s and 90s, and relevant to Sankt Pauli and Hamburg and how they differ. So Sankt Pauli is essentially the small, like, kind of junior partner in Hamburg football. It spent a handful of seasons in the Bundesliga, most of its time in the second and third divisions. Why they are so famous and why they are so kind of well known around the world is because in the 1980s, Hamburg's got a really interesting kind of like social culture connected to it. In the 1980s, there's a massive squatter movement and punk movement that kind of lived in the kind of rundown area, the dock area of Sankt Pauli, and in the kind of the apartments and kind of flats around there. For some kind of unknown reason, they decided that they were going to, for their entertainment, go to the football on a Saturday. And they decided to go to the club just up the road, literally a stone's throw from the Reeperbahn, and get behind the team there. And they brought with them that kind of left-wing anarchist, like kind of political stance. And from there, a whole fan culture emerged, and more people came, buoyed by the atmosphere. And interestingly, a lot of fans, and this just doesn't happen too often, a lot of fans from HSV, from Hauslau in the 1980s, were really disillusioned with kind of what you experienced a little bit of there, the far right presence on the terrace. And there was quite in German football at that time, there was quite a vocal kind of neo-Nazi movement that attached themselves to football clubs. And so quite a lot of Hauslau fans came across and switched allegiances and joined Sankt Pauli. And from there, Sankt Pauli has got this reputation as a kind of progressive left-wing political club that kind of stands in contrast with the much more bigger corporate HSV. So that's kind of the background of the city, and that's kind of what drew me in. I first went in 2007, and I was drawn to Sankt Pauli because of the politics that went alongside the football. I've always loved football, you know, for as long as I can remember. grew up watching football. Tim's going to hate this. I was a Graham Taylor disciple, a Watford fan. And I got a few things that maybe off mic we'll have a little conversation about some of his comments on Graham Taylor.
Put him right, put him right, mate. You go on.
But that aside, so I grew up with all of that, then became disillusioned with kind of the way English football was going, and was looking for something else. Found Sankt Pauli, went over to a game, and have been going for like 16, 17 years now. And the reason I go is because of that, because of the atmosphere, because of the kind of political element. And it's certainly not because of the football, because that's been dreadful most of this time.
Although, didn't they have a good season last year, as I recall? Was it last season?
Tail end of last season, and this season, where the men's first team are in the unprecedented position of being 10 points clear of the promotion places at the top of the second Bundesliga. It's going to take a cock-up of some Sankt Pauli proportions, and they're pretty good at it, for them not to go up, which would see them back in the Bundesliga for the first time since 2011. So, yeah, they are having a great season, the men's team.
What interests me about from afar, the Sankt Pauli phenomenon, is I think it leads to a discussion about what it is to be on the left. What does it mean to be on the left?
Yeah.
Because one's traditional conception of left would be based in the trade union movement, based in organised workers, which historically has been quite often socially conservative, and in many cases hostile to immigrant labour. And then it's the Sankt Pauli story seems to me to be essentially one of the countercultural left.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, personally, I think these things have to be brought together, because the most obvious glance at any advanced society will tell you that, number one, a significant part of the working class are women, and number two, a significant part of the working class are non-white. So I for me, there's absolutely no contradiction, but it seems that contradiction exists. And in the Hamburg thing is the bigger club, Hamburg. Has that been associated with the traditional labour movement, and Sankt Pauli coming much more from squatters and countercultural elements who are looking for social diversity?
Quite possibly. I think you've definitely got a point there, in that Hamburg are kind of perceived as the bourgeois club. However, as we know from the makeup of the majority of football fans, perhaps not these days, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, their support was probably still largely born from the working class. Yeah. But like you say, maybe a slightly more socially conservative version of the working class. Whereas the Sankt Pauli support originally, back when this phenomenon started, they were very much from the autonomous anarchist black bloc kind of movement that, you're right, weren't connected to the formal kind of left of the trade union movement. So it was much more anarchist kind of based. And obviously it's, they're a professional football club now. That's not the case at all. But that's kind of where the ideology and the has come from, which kind of explains why, as a club and a fan base, the main driver over this last 10 years has been kind of that kind of welcoming of refugees within the club, within Germany. They've got a refugee club attached to them. Actually went over this weekend for their 10th birthday party, and they have helped 400 young men in the last 10 years have been a part of their refugee program. So yeah, I think you're right. It's less that formal, more socially conservative version of socialism, and the more veering on the more anarchist side.
Is that what attracted you? That's why you got involved with them?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's something that in the UK or in Britain, it just doesn't exist. We don't have that formal on the continent. You're probably well aware of this. In Italy and Germany, fan bases within clubs traditionally go to the left or the right, and if you've got an ultra group or a kind of bigger fan base, they will identify with one aspect of the political spectrum, and we simply don't do that in Britain. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it was that connection of politics, and that just has never appeared anywhere else in my football going experience, that really attracted it to me. And the fact that there are so many good social projects around the club and from supporters, that it feels like it's not just a case of, we're not just I can't think of the word, like, we're not just, it's not performative. There is actually the attempt to make things better behind that.
Yeah, I don't lose sight of the fact that, we're talking about women's football,
yes,
specifically in Germany. But I will say one thing about the squatter movement in Germany that I was familiar with back in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, early 80s, was in Berlin. And it's really interesting because it comes out of something, or as I recall, it came out of something that was a priori of the punk movement. Having said that, because the punk movement had, younger people just couldn't afford rents and so on. So there was this whole vast area of Berlin that you could just rock up. You could just rock up like I would do several times, and you'd always be assured somewhere to stay for the night and so on, because there were a lot of other younger people like yourself. But the squatters movement, so to speak, as slightly distinct from the punk movement in Berlin, the squatters movement was kind of in the hands of older, like serious anarchists. Do you know what I mean? It was kind of like, whoa. We're just playing at being anarchists. These people were trying to convince you politically.
It's what you're saying here is there's that classic German earnestness behind it.
I think there was with older people, and by older I mean people who were 23 rather than 19, and some people who were in their 30s and 40s, as I recall it very clearly. And I think that also, I mean, it's funny that in Germany you've got this rule that forbids corporate companies coming to own clubs. So there's a lot of fan investment in clubs in any case, which to me already seemed a little bit punkish, already seemed a little bit, not necessarily to the left, but more radical than the football experience that I'd had over here. The idea that, any fan could own a share in a football club, it's something that's mooted over here now, but go back 30, 40 years, nobody was talking about that then. Nobody whatsoever. So I always thought Germany was slightly advanced. Okay, back to the football. Of course, you've written a book on this as well. Remind me what your book's called.
So my book is called Forza Sankt Pauli, and it's actually a sequel. So 10 years ago, I wrote a book called...
Forza is Italian though, isn't it?
Yeah,
Forza,
it is. Yeah, it is Italian, but it's that kind of ultra crossover where they use little bits of, they'll sing a song in French, or they kind of borrow from all different parts of Europe. But yeah, so this book that's just come out is a follow-up to a book I wrote called Pirates, Punks and Politics, which was basically telling the history of Sankt Pauli for an English-speaking audience, because loads of English people are interested, or British people are interested in going over and do go over to Sankt Pauli, but there was a real lack of information about the history of the club in English. It was always regurgitating the same newspaper articles where, like, oh, it's the Reeperbahn, you've got the punks, the anti-fascist things going on, but it's always the same story. So I wanted to tell that in a bit more detail, which I did in that book. This is like maybe a little bit of a vanity project. It's 10 years on, and it's just describing the history of the club in the modern day, because I do think this last decade has been, for me, has been one of the most politically kind of tumultuous that I can remember. Just thinking about the things that have happened. We had a massive the refugee crisis in the early part of the decade. We had Brexit, we had Trump, we had COVID. There's so much that has gone on, and because Sankt Pauli is so political, a lot of those events got refracted through it. So I wanted to tell that story of the last 10 years, not just focus on what happened in the 1980s. And a big part of that story is the growth of women's football. I think that's been one of the major positive news stories certainly in the last decade, is the fact that we now have, or we're now approaching, a state where kind of women are getting as much attention, media coverage, crowds as in men's football. So for a big part of the book, I talk about the history of the women's football department at Sankt Pauli, and that leads us on then to the game that we will eventually talk about, which is Sankt Pauli's first. Well, it's actually their second game because they won the first one. Their first ever cup run in the German Cup. They'd never played in the German FA Cup before. So this game and the one they won in the round beforehand are their first ever games. So that's the historic element of this particular match.
And who is on the field and who is in the stands for this game?
So what is so good about in the stands in this game is that the game was played in front of a record crowd in Hamburg for a women's game of 19,710, and it's pretty much the regular Sankt Pauli fan base, because the women's team itself has a really small but loyal following, maybe of a couple of hundred, but because the game was against the local rivals, it was in the German FA Cup, it was moved to the main stadium, and then obviously generated a lot of media interest. So the regular Sankt Pauli fans came along and filled all the open sections of the stadium. So, and credit to Hamburg as well, they brought over 3,000 fans into the away section. So it was made up of Hamburg football fan, the football community that would be attending.
It sounds, I mean, the crowd noise sounds quite male.
Yeah, although interestingly, so one of the problems Sankt Pauli has as a club for the men's team is season ticket holders are in place and they're not giving up their season tickets, and it's really hard to get tickets for the men's team. And as a result, the men's crowd demographic, like we see in England, is getting older, and probably more middle class as they get a little bit older. So you worry where that next generation of fans comes from. What was said locally about this game was actually this allowed, because season tickets didn't apply and all of these things, it actually brought a much younger crowd. So there were loads of women and children in the ground. The demographic was slightly different. However, listening to it I watched a bit of it back this morning, and you're right, the camera position is right under where the ultra group was standing, and so yeah, that group is loud, male, and and quite young, but embrace the experience of it as well. So that's off the pitch. On the pitch, you've got the Sankt Pauli team, who are 100% amateur. Most of the players, this is the kind of highest level that they have played at. So Sankt Pauli play in the third tier of German women's football, which is regionalized. They had one player who has played in the Frauen Bundesliga. She called Rachel Rinas. She's coming to the end of her career, Swiss international. The Hamburg team are in the second Bundesliga, so the second tier, and I think they're largely semi-professional. So there's a big gap in kind of quality, you could say, between the two players, which kind of feeds into that Sankt Pauli myth of the David and Goliath. The small underdog and the big corporate monster from the suburbs. So that was the disparity on the pitch.
What about members of immigrant communities on the field?
On the field now, and again, this is very similar, I think, to British women's football. Predominantly a white. The players are predominantly white, I would say, the vast majority, and that is, I can't speak too well for Germany, but I think for England, that's because women's football is typically, or over the preceding years, been quite a middle class sport, so it might not have been as open to people of different ethnicities or of immigrant backgrounds.
You would imagine, and as I say, this is complete ignorance because I've never been, but a huge immigrant community in Germany is the Turkish one, who I'd imagine would be more socially conservative in terms of the role of women. Yeah,
quite possibly. So that may play into the demographic of the crowd being, there are people who would criticize Sankt Pauli saying, they claim to be this big anti-racist club, and yet look at your supporter base, it's 97% white.
Yeah.
And you can't. It's hard not to agree with that if you look around the crowd. But yeah, I think both on.
Well, I do think, and apologies for cutting you, Nick, but if we look at the British experience, I do think it takes time for an immigrant community to absorb more than embrace the local football culture. I think it takes a bit of time. I think you start off and you're one step removed from the host community. Your next generation, of course, is part of that community. Not necessarily encouraging your children to follow in, because your attitude to, and particularly if you watch football as a sort of a bystander rather than getting involved in the game, your attitude to it, if you come from somewhere like Turkey or other, socially conservative areas around the world, is just that it's a little bit rowdy, and you brought your children over here to do better, as it were. There's all of that to do.
Yeah, not to burn down the science lab. That's the point that you're trying to make. That's the elephant in the room here. That's why you brought your kids over, to get an education, not to burn down the bloody science lab.
I'm so glad
I did all. I'm so grateful. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was just going to say, I'm so glad that I didn't really excel at sciences in school, so I was steer clear of the science lab.
Yeah. Tim's referring to a book that I had the temerity to put out and to confess to my part in the burning down of the science lab.
Called EFFRIES. It's available from all fine booksellers and others not so fine as well. They'll all take your money.
Oh yes, of course they will. But let me just finish this quick point.
Go on. Yeah, it was a good point. It was good. I was enjoying it before I cruelly interrupted it.
No, that's all right. But do you know what I've seen in German football has actually been amazing. When you see somebody like a young person like Musiala playing for Germany, let alone the likes of Leroy Sané, let alone the likes of Rudiger and so on, it's still a little bit of a surprise for me, in this generation. So you can imagine what it's like for those people. And I'm, British through and through. You could argue by now I'm absorbed totally in the football culture and in the local cultures. But it's still a little bit. Musiala is amazing, by the way. But that's another. And he should have been playing for England. But that's another story that we'll put to one side. But when you see that, you can see the emergence or the involvement of German football in terms of, well, there are other Turkish players before, as you know, but you can suddenly see the involvement of the generation of immigrants coming through. It will take a little bit of a step longer for the women to come through, but I can guarantee you we can reconvene in 5, if not 10 years' time, and you'll see that the immigrant communities will be as dominant in German football, women's football, as it is, or as it's becoming in the men's football.
Do you think, Nick, that with its commitment to diversity, that Sankt Pauli have a real opportunity to grab the women's game and to run with it, to be a leading force in the women's game? Is that a chance?
I think that's almost like the $1 million question, because I think you're absolutely right. For a progressive, kind of socially progressive left-wing club, your initial instinct is that they should be pushing the women's game as much as possible. You've got a crowd base that would accept going to games to enjoy that experience. And that's almost my first reaction is of this they need to push this and make it as big as the men. However, and it's a massive however that has caused a lot of issues within the club in the context of this game, which again we will get to talk about in a second, and the wider development of the women's team at Sankt Pauli. How it works in German football, in German sports organizations, is so the women's team are their own department. So they have their own department within the club. They have their own budget, and they are in control of making whatever decisions they want to make to do the relevant improvements, to push for promotion, all of those kind of things. And there is that, and I'm absolutely as guilty of it as anybody else, is kind of as thinking of yourself as like a progressive man. I am like, we should be throwing money at this. We should be trying to make them as high profile as possible. it's not our decision to make. You know, musty old white men, middle-aged white men like myself have had the power in every sphere of football for too long. The decision for in St. Pauli for the women's team to evolve, to grow, to look at going professional needs to be with the members of that particular department. And if they choose to have a much slower, more organic growth, then that is absolutely fine, because they have autonomy over their particular aspect of the club. And that's caused a little bit of, like, you know, of interesting discussion in recent months, because it is like, yeah, we should be throwing as much weight behind this as possible. Yeah, actually, it's not our decision to make. So I think, you know, we've got lessons to learn there. We can be really enthusiastic and really supportive, but it's not down to us.
It's nothing like success, though, is there? I mean, they must be looking at the women's game in England and thinking, wow, you know, Arsenal can fill a stadium every single weekend. They can fill their stadium because the women's game gets sold out now, like the men's game. And they must be looking at that and thinking, well, the future looks rosy. But it started off in England with the success of the Lionesses, the national team. In this game, which we will now talk about, from last year, is it the Pokal?
The DFB Pokal, so the German FA Cup.
Yeah, DFB Pokal, against those noisy neighbours from the suburbs. What happens?
Well, so what happens is there's a lot of excitement around the game. You've got nearly 20,000 people inside the stadium, and you've got the classic mismatch, and everybody's hoping for a cup upset. Within 4 minutes, St. Pauli find themselves 2-0 down. By half time, they're 4-0 down. And you know, it is they're completely outclassed. You were talking about members of you know, perhaps people of different ethnicities. The best player on the pitch was a young woman called Lisa Baum, who is, I think, must be of some kind of African heritage. I don't know her background. She was by far and away the best player for Hamburg on the pitch. But yeah, it was supposed to be, you know, the chance of an upset. The upset was gone 4 minutes into the game. But what was so fantastic about it was, as you could kind of hear on the footage in the background, the St. Pauli fans never stopped backing the team. So you're going in, trooping off the pitch at half-time, 4-0 down. The crowd were as loud as they were at kickoff. So it was over as a contest really, really quickly. Teams came out in the second half. The goals continued to flow. On 88 minutes, Hamburg scored their 7th. So it's 7-0. The crowd is still 100% behind the home team, and the Hamburg fans are doing their thing in the away corner. They're nice and loud as well. So the atmosphere was incredible. I've been to a lot of men's games at the Millerntor. The atmosphere is always good. This seemed to be another level. And then the key moment in the match happened in the 90th minute. I don't really know how it happened. I was behind the goal, taking photos, actually. Rachel Renast, who we spoke about before, former Swiss international, broke into the box, out kind of powered a defender, hit a shot against the crossbar, and there was that collective gasp of, that was the moment, we would have got the consolation. Bounced down off the crossbar, player comes rushing in, Jolene Flirter, she bundles the ball into the net, and the whole place just goes absolutely crazy. You know, you wouldn't think it was a consolation goal in the 90th minute. It was like we'd won the German Cup. It was that amazing.
It sounds even better that way, because it's a collective goal, isn't it? Yes. You know, someone bundling it shot, someone bundles it in. So it's like all of you in the stadium, you've all scored the goal together. It was almost
like, yeah, it had been kind of, you know, sucked over the line, like they used to say about the Kop. You know, they've got that ability to kind of create a goal, you know, just from the stands. And it was just such a fantastic moment, because it was the kind of relief of, we've got a consolation. But it felt like the winner. It felt like we'd scored a 90th.
Next goal wins.
And those are the rules.
Yeah, the rules. Yeah, that's it.
I mean, maybe that's how we settle cup ties from now on. Next goal wins. It's brilliant. And then literally moments later, the whistle blew, and the kind of outpouring of emotion at the end. I was really lucky to be pitch side, like I said, taking photos. And the players didn't leave the pitch for 20 minutes. The crowd didn't leave the stand for 20 minutes after, and they were just singing to each other. And it was incredible. It was just one of those. I've watched a lot of football, and it was just one of those moments that kind of, talking about it now kind of makes me want to cry, because it meant so much to the players, and it meant so much to the fans. And so it didn't matter that we've been outclassed. If that had been a men's game, there would have been a riot. You know, I've actually been at a Sankt Pauli game where we lost at home 4-0 to Hamburg for the men, and literally the whole terrace was on fire by the end of the game, because people were so upset. Here we were, consolation goal, felt like we won the cup. So
that really is footballers' communion, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
it
football.
Really
That is football.
Yeah,
and it's okay to cry, mate, because I do it all the time. You know, just bring it on. If you're gonna cry like a man, cry.
I don't know how you do it. You're gonna have to teach me. I don't know how you do that one. And I got educated out of me as a kid.
Listen, mate, I don't do it willingly, but like you say, Nick, when the emotion gets you, you know, what can you do?
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever been as happy after a defeat in football as I was there, because it simply didn't feel like a defeat. It was just a celebration, like you say. It was a coming together, and I knew how much it meant for that group of players. They're mostly a young group of players, to play in that stadium. A lot of them are fans of Sankt Pauli men's team anyway. So for them to get an experience of that atmosphere, you know, was just incredible. So it was a really, really special moment. However, there is, like with these things, there's always a postscript. So I don't know if you caught any of the footage at the start of the game, and this is a common thing that happens in Germany, the lighting of pyro. So at the start of the game, when the teams came out, the whole of the front of the stand was ablaze with pyrotechnics, with flares. Just recently, the DFB issued the fine to Sankt Pauli for the use of those flares in that cup game. It amounted to €15,000. You might be fascinated by this. I certainly was. It appears the DFB have a person who, at the end of a game where pyro has been used in the stadium, watches the footage back and counts how many individual flares have been used, and calculates the fine based on that at €200 per flare. So working that out, there were 75 flares charged at €15,000. Where it gets really interesting, and where it perhaps shows that even at Sankt Pauli, you know, the embracement of, that's not a word, but the embracement of women's football isn't quite what it should be, is that fine was not paid by the club. It was passed directly onto the women's department. The women's department operate on a €30,000 budget. So half of their annual budget was going to go on paying the fines from this pyro. So there's been a lot of kind of talk about that. Fortunately, as quite often happens in Sankt Pauli, the fans have stepped in. They said, the women's department aren't paying this fine. We are going to raise the money. And through donations at matches and various other ways, they're going to get the money to pay the fine. But it's just really interesting that the club, for all its progressiveness and for, you know, really good, they hosted the game in the stadium, they weren't prepared to kind of contribute to the paying of the costs involved in that.
Was somewhat patronising, given what you said earlier about the women's team should be able to decide their own destiny, really. Isn't it somewhat patronising? Okay, we'll pick up this tab because you're the women's team. I just wonder whether there are sort of sexual or gender politics at play here, that you're damned if you do.
Well, how about we pick up the tab because it's our club?
Yeah. I think the problem is around the fact that the decision to play the game in the main stadium wasn't one taken by the women's department in isolation, so they wouldn't have been allowed to make that decision. So the fact that it was put on like a men's match day, if that had happened in the men's team, again, I don't think that team, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe that money doesn't come directly out of the men's playing budget. Maybe it comes out of a larger corporate pot. So the fact that I think there's an element of disappointment that money, that the club didn't do something, or at least to kind of offer to contribute to it, knowing how small the women's budget is. But fortunately, the plus side is that the fans have stepped in and they'll raise that money quite easily, and that will remove that problem and maybe or highlight that inequality as well.
Has the team showed progress this season? Is it going somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the same. Well, it's the same team that we had at the start of the season. They are they're in a bit of a relegation battle in their division, in the 3rd tier. I think they will probably do enough to stay up. I hope they will. Yeah, I mean, I think they would be happy with their progress. Again, this is where they're not ready to make that next step to go semi-professional. Most of the players are students or have got jobs, and that comes to the question: what do? Do you rip that team apart and bring in people who could get you promotion, or do you try and evolve the team that you've got already? And for me, you always stick with kind of what you've got and try and build from there. So, yeah, I think that's where they.
If the men's team get promotion, though, how will that impact on the women's team?
We were talking about this the other day as well. I'm not entirely sure. Again, because of the way it's set up with departments and budgets, it will mean the club as a whole has more money, and they might decide to allocate some more money to the women's team. You think it could only be a good thing because, having that it's like the difference between the Premier League and the Championship. Being in the Bundesliga, the television money that you're going to get, it puts the club in a sounder financial position. And we know trickle down economics doesn't work. So I don't know if that would trickle down to the women's team. But you think in terms of exposure, then it's got to be a good thing.
Yeah, trickle down in economics is an oxymoron, isn't it? But we've been talking about the match in the German FA Cup on the 8th of September 2023. So you can imagine what the charts on the 8th of September last year was like, can't you, Tim? Were you dancing away to the... So we always take a look at the soundtrack of the iconic matches that we want to talk about. This has been an iconic match, not necessarily because, there was some great football in it, but because it's one that you remember. And I hate going to matches which are brilliant matches, but, you come away just like indifferent. Whereas this, like you say, that final consolation goal, it made it all worthwhile. But what about the chart? Does the appearance twice in the charts of Fleetwood Mac make it all worthwhile for you, Tim? Your Lindsey Buckingham reference earlier on?
No, I'm not a fan. I think I went above and beyond the Call of Duty, listening to the entire top 20 last night.
Done.
Wow.
Yeah, all of them. Yeah, all of the top 20, and I'm nonplussed. I'm nonplussed by many things about the modern world, but the number one record, Doja Cat, Paint the Town Red. It's Walk On By, right? It's Walk On By. That's what it is. Dion Moore, Walk On By. Yeah. So you've got this beautiful Walk On By is just a gorgeous record. It's a lovely, lovely record. So you've got this sweet backing. And then the first words are, yeah, bitch. Thinking, oh, for Christ, what's happened? What has happened to the world where you can take something like Walk On By and transform it into, yeah, bitch?
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. How about Taylor Swift, though? Cruel Summer. Did that appeal to you at all, Nick?
Well, yeah, look, I didn't get as far as Tim in going for the full 20. I stopped at number 6 and then just kind of just so I can't do this anymore. But really interesting, the whole top 5, considering we're talking about women's football, the first top 5 are all female artists, which I'm not sure would have happened 20 years ago. I don't know. Where do I stand on Taylor Swift? Wow, I've got
I just wondered if Cruel Summer, given that she's on the world tour, the biggest grossing world tour ever, she'll be over the side of the water later on in the summer, etc. And she's got some competition in Billie Eilish in particular at number 4 with What Was I Made For, but also Olivia Rodrigo. I think it's fair to say last year was her year. In fact,
I've never heard a song with the word fame fucker in it before. That was a first for me.
So I've got two
Bloodsucker,
daughters.
fame fucker. Yeah, wasn't expecting that one.
Both of them are Taylor Swift
Thank
fans.
you.
I have a confession. I have been to see Taylor Swift at Wembley Stadium on her Reputation tour. Cost me a bloody fortune to take the girls to it. They loved it. They also have tickets for the Eras tour coming up this summer. So by a process of osmosis, I have listened to a lot of Taylor Swift. And I do actually quite like a lot of her work. I think her work rate is phenomenal. I mean, she churns out albums like there's no tomorrow. I like the fact that she's kind of evolved from as a country artist into a pop artist. I think that's quite a nice like growth. But yeah, so that and Olivia Rodrigo, both my girls one of my daughters is really into that and was gutted to miss out on tour tickets. So I've listened to a fair bit of those kind of things. Yeah, the lyrics, you're right. It's something else these days. Yeah, very, very.
Although looking further in the charts, to the top 20, you start seeing women all over. This is dominated by women.
It is.
At 19,
it is.
Kylie Minogue, Miley Cyrus at number 18 with Used to Be Young.
I quite like her. I mean, you just Nick, you just talked about Taylor Swift as a country artist expanding, and she's the daughter of Billy Ray Cyrus, which is a strange place to start. I would have thought, would give anyone an achy breaky heart. But what I usually like about her music,
it was a great place.
What I really quite like about her music is it's honest. And it's not my stuff at all. But this one, Used to Be Young, she really is telling her story. You can tell when something's authentic. Authenticity. If you can fake that, you got everything. But I don't think she is faking it. I think, she really is telling a story. And I think it communicates because of that. And for me, it's one of the very few in the top 20, which is as far as I could go, that really had something to communicate.
Do you know what she does? Miley Cyrus, and she's got a few other tunes in the charts. So number 30, she's got Flowers as well. What she's done is her songs have grown with her in the kind of way, that Adele tries to do and say, look, this album is the album that I made when I was 21. So therefore, these are the love songs from when I was 21. Now I'm 30 and, they're slightly more mature love songs and stuff. Because actually, and I had this conversation with my missus just yesterday, actually. We were talking about a song which unbelievably is 20 years old now, a song by Lamar, who was one of these, I suppose, reality TV show kind of winners, in the talent show winners. And then his first big single was a tune called If There's Any Justice in the World, You'd Be With Me kind of thing. And it's a half decent song, I would say. And then I read, because I couldn't believe it was 20 years old, I went online and thought, is this really 20 years old? Have I lost 20 years of my life without knowing it? And then it said that the song was initially offered to Hearsay, who you might not remember, but they were the first of these reality TV show stars before X Factor. I think it was Pop Idol or whatever. They were the first sort of group that came out of that, and they had a single which was a decent single. They were rubbish, but the single was kind of decent, but I can't even remember it now in comparison to Lamar, who came subsequently. But their single shot to number one, and it was the biggest selling single of all time at the time. It might have been surpassed since then, but they were initially offered that song, the Lamar song, If There's Any Justice in the World, but they thought it was too mature for them. And at first I thought, too mature for them at their age. But what they're talking about is too mature for their audience, because they've gone down the pop route and gotten weenie boppers at the age of, 12 or 13 to follow them. So you can't suddenly put out a grown-up love song of, you should be with me rather than the other guy kind of thing. You can't do that for kids. It's puppy love for kids. And what Miley Cyrus has done is allow her songs, the maturity of her songs, to grow with her. So she's not trying to do the songs that she was doing when she wasn't Hannah Montana. Who was she, Nick? You should know, you got daughters.
I think she wasn't she?
Yeah.
No, Hannah Montana was the other. Was she Hannah Montana? Oh, maybe she was Hannah Montana, because there was the other one. There was Hannah Montana, and there was another. Oh, okay.
If we ever go on Mastermind, this kind of stuff is not going to be our specialist subject. Is there anything there that kind of leaps out at you? There's one I wanted to ask both of you about, which was news to me, and I don't really understand it. But there's something there. Dave and Central C Sprinter. I haven't got a clue what they're talking about, but it sounds. It does contain a phrase. I don't have generational wealth, which again I thought was quite interesting. And yeah, there seems to be a lot of posturing about being rich, and I think that all gets quite tiresome. But it seems to be quite well done. It's one that kind of stood out for me.
Yeah, it's in the grime world, isn't it? It's Dave's quite big now. Well, it was big at this time last year. It was massive. He's been big for probably about 5 years now. Put out an album, didn't he, during the pandemic? We're all in this together alone, which took that sort of political phrase, we're all in this together, but then added a reality to it. Mm-hmm. I think he's all right. He's all right. He's not my favourite rapper at all. Stormzy's a better rapper, I think, and he's in here in a couple of tunes of his as well. But he's not my favourite rapper, but I do get what he does, which is add a bit of intelligence to the lyrics. Does that make sense?
Is there anything for you here, Nick?
So for me, it's aside from the tunes that I've kind of got to know through my children, it really feels it's that point where you feel this chart isn't for me or about me. It's
and probably shouldn't be really, but we're old.
Yeah. But even you sort of think, even going back maybe 10 or 15 years, I could probably find something. It just feels like the world has moved on. Like you say, the lyrics now, like they can say this in records and it doesn't get banned. So yeah, there's not a lot there for me, I'm afraid, in that, certainly in that top 20 that I kind of had a quick look at.
There's a lot of Barbie in it, but again, that's not for you and I, is it? You're shaking your head. I'm just letting people know that you're shaking your head.
Let the record state that the defendant is shaking his head.
Exactly. Mate, it's been a great conversation.
Yes.
I think this deserves a part 2 about Sankt Pauli itself. And good luck with the book, Forza Sankt. Or you say, sorry?
Forza Sankt Pauli, yeah. So
yeah, Forza Sankt Pauli. That's what threw me with the Forza bit, because I knew there was that right-wing party in Italy, wasn't it? Forza Italia. And it always felt like an Italian phrase to me. But hey, listen, good luck with it. And let's welcome you back on another occasion, Nick, if you've got time.
Yeah, absolutely. Love to come on and talk again. So thank you very much for having me. I just need to mention to Tim before we go, we are alumni of, is that the word, of the same degree course at the same university, but 6 years apart, I think.
Right. History and Politics 84 to 87.
Oh, wow.
Was.
Okay, so I was History of Politics 90 to 93.
Right. You've made a happy man very old.
Yeah.
Yeah. And did you see his moniker? Did he scratch his moniker on the desk?
I really
was that just me? Was that just me in EFFRIES? You can read all about it. Sorry.
I mean, the politics department was still standing; it hadn't been burnt down, so I assumed that we've been nowhere near it long. So, but shamefully,
Please don't follow him. Otherwise,
I wasn't a great student of either history or politics. I spent a lot of time reading the Daily Mirror and playing football. That was my university experience. So, yeah. But I was following in great footsteps. I just
it all counts. It all counts. As long as you got a degree, it all counts. So don't worry about that, mate. Thank you very much. So we've been looking at the German FA Cup. Sankt Pauli ladies taking on Hamburg, the noisy neighbours from the suburbs, and Nick clearly isn't happy about them at all. The professionals versus the amateurs, and well, put it this way. David lost. Both with a sling and a
But
stone.
but the future belongs to Sankt Pauli. Forza.
Well, let's wait and see. Tim, thank you very much, Nick.